Morning, James.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm good, just chilling right now.
Yeah, happy Friday. Jace, I heard you had an excellent plant identification experience.
Oh wait, for lab?
Yeah,
Yeah, I was a little scared and I was like, Dr. Lesser, we need to go back to that one tree because I need to look at it again. But I ended up getting it right. I was like, thank you.
awesome. Awesome. Confidence in that ID skills. Good. What's the weather like back home? Is it raining still?
Yes,
Ugh,
ish,
yeah.
cloudy.
Getting warmer though?
Yeah, a little. We never really made it back up to the 70-degree days we had.
Yeah. Well, I'm in Pennsylvania and like all the flowering trees, the dogwoods, the magnolias, they're all in full bloom. It's just like a totally different experience. I feel like I'm in Florida. Actually, it was 80 at midnight when I arrived on Thursday morning with the kids. So
It was 80 in Pennsylvania? Are you in
Yeah.
southern Pennsylvania?
Yeah, you know that like it was like the worst time for me to drive with my night blindness and the rain. It was like a huge front was like tracking through New Jersey and on
Right.
my path. And as soon as I got into Pennsylvania, it stopped, and like we stopped to get gas, and it was like a bazillion degrees, muggy. You know, it must have just the front came through and changed things.
And you had the kids with you. That's a heck of a drive, Danielle.
It was horrible. Well, I was like, I could do it at night when they're going to be quiet and we'll probably fall asleep, or I could do it
Right.
during the day and it will be worse for me.
Sure. Yes,
So
I mean,
we-
I've been in like the Waverly area, which is kind of Naples, so northeast, and that is like 9 hours to get to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
if you
this
were
wasn't
further
too bad.
south-
I was like 6.5.
Oh, that's not so bad.
Yeah, not too bad.
Where are you again?
So my father-in-law passed away, so we're
Oh, I'm sorry.
visiting family. Thank you guys. I'm in Bluebell right now, which is kind of near Villanova, where I went to undergrad.
Well, very nice that you get to be somewhere warm, but I'm sorry about the circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's just good to be here with family. Did you get to South Carolina okay?
I am, yes,
Awesome.
absolutely. Alabama next.
Excellent. Wow. Are you road tripping?
I am.
Oh my goodness. That's exciting stuff. Anyway,
very.
yeah. Well, happy Friday, guys. We have one more lecture after the one I'm starting today, which is exciting. And the plan will be for next Friday will be like open review time. And so I want to start today just talking about populations and how we manage populations, especially the ones that get totally out of control. So things like biocontrol and pesticides and cultural control, which involves like crop rotations and mowing and that sort of thing. So I'm going to share screen. I am down to like one monitor and working off the computer. So we'll see how today goes, but let me know when you don't see things you should be seeing. So right now, are you seeing my PowerPoint? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. And you know what? Let me minimize this because I want to, some of you jumped ahead on the syllabus. So now you can see the syllabus. I'm going to make it a little bigger. No, it has now gone away. All right, hold on. I jumped the gun on what I was going to share. All right. Now the syllabus. Okay. So we're right at the very end. We have one homework left. And we've gone through sort of the threats to ecosystems, the human impacts lecture. Now we're on to the managing the pests. There's one more homework, and I know at least, you know, one person has reached out to me with a question about it. So I wanted to let you know it's there. It's kind of a retrospective thing. So you get to pick a disease, and then you get to kind of walk us through, like, how do things like temperature and moisture, like those abiotics we talked about, play into this disease spread? Who's the host? Well, let me just show you what it is. All that kind of stuff. So, and then you're going to forecast, you know, like what biomes do we tend to see it in, all that sort of thing. You can start it at any time. It's just a Word document. You can drop it in the Dropbox whenever. But it's probably just kind of a good review of concepts as you're preparing. So I wanted to let you know that that is there. So let's pull up that homework so you can see it, if I can find it. Are you seeing something with a bat on it?
No.
Okay. All right. It seems whenever I switch tabs, I have to reshare things. All right, now I'm hoping you are seeing it. So when you click on that disease homework on the main page down and towards the bottom, I think I put it in with this pest management. And so it's just a series of questions, but I'm letting it be totally open-ended, that you guys can select any disease from the list. And if there's one that you've just been curious about, you know, feel free to use that one. But I put a whole bunch of in the news diseases here. And then there's some questions. So, you know, what biome do you find it in? How do these abiotics impact the spread of that disease? What's your animal vector that carries it? Who's the host? How does it spread between? Is it waterborne, airborne, so on, direct contact? And then things like the human impacts, right? So the things that we just talked about in the last lecture, how does us changing the landscape, managing for habitats, the increase in fire, increase in urbanization, how does that impact this disease? How will climate change impact the disease? And then number 10 is the one that tends to get people stuck. And it's not necessary that, you know, whatever disease you pick, it may not be relevant, but one particular disease, Ebola, tends to strike in areas where there's a lot of rituals associated with death. So, you know, when people die, they bring them out to the river, they bring them to the lake, and they bathe them, right, as sort of a cultural kind of religious thing. And so then everybody is exposed to disease, right? So you may find, as you're digging into information about the disease, that there is some kind of cultural component that can propagate the spread of it. But if not, you know, if it's something totally irrelevant, then just write NA for that. What demographic of the population is impacted? Some affect males more than females, some affect old versus young, right? So that's what we're talking about with demography there. And then survivorship, do we predict that, you know, I mean, is it usually that most people will die once they're impacted by this disease? And then is there a cure or any kind of treatment, that sort of thing? So like, for example, if somebody picked malaria, you've probably heard in the news more recently, they've had a lot of success with this new vaccine. And so, you know, you could mention something along those lines. So the one thing to make sure you do is whatever source you find, make sure you just keep documenting it at the bottom. Okay. So again, no, it's kind of rolling deadline type thing. So you can submit that whenever you want. I just want to let you know that it was there. Okay. All right. Just moving the screen stuff around. Back to the PowerPoint.
I have a quick question about the lab homework before we get started.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So I went to submit it and it's only accepting like presentations, and I have mine in a Google Doc because we had to write down like the plastic items we touched and a
Oh, yeah, yep.
screenshot of our plastic footprint and then the slide of the graphics. So is there any way like you could like change it to accept other documents? 'Cause right now
absolutely,
it's only
yeah.
like presentations and slides.
Yes, I will do that. So
Okay.
you made it in a Google Sheet?
Yeah, like a Google Doc. I can download it as like a PDF or Microsoft.
No, it's okay.
Word or
I'll
whatever,
just
but
go in. I must have just not hit all of this presentations formats and just picked a handful of them, but I can add that in. I'll do that
okay,
as soon as I
thank
get
you.
off. Yep, no problem. Thanks. Okay. You guys seeing bunnies? Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Okay, so today we're going to talk about populations. And we've covered population growth in the past, right? We know that some of them can grow exponentially. And so we're going to talk about how we can there's intrinsic value to populations, even if they do seem to be pests. They are living beings. So there are many people who are opposed to any sort of control. So there's that intrinsic value, but then there's also kind of a consumptive value for some of these populations. Think about fish populations, think about deer, right? We hunt them. Think about trees. Many people cut them down for timber and so on. So there's a consumptive value to them. And then there's a non-consumptive type of a value. It's more the ecosystem services. So we've talked about, wetlands being really important in gas exchange, and mangroves being important in, preventing storm surge and things like that. So we'll be covering the values of populations. We'll also talk about pests. So the definition of pests is very anthropogenic. It's something that we came up with. It's this idea that when populations get out of control, say a top predator is removed or they're an invasive species that have moved in with no control, member in the community. If it's a plant, they're often, called weeds, but usually insects and some like rodents and whatnot, we would call pests. So how do we control them? There's a lot of different ways. And one of the ways is just natural control, right? Knowing that there's probably a predator or a parasite, some sort of disease in the community that's going to be able to knock their numbers down with sort of a top-down approach naturally. So we wouldn't need to do anything. We just kind of need to wait and let time take its toll. Then pesticides, so we could use chemical control. Cultural control, as I mentioned, is kind of how we manipulate the land. So rotating crops and leaving some crop residues, things like that. Genetic control, insertion of genes like we see with BT corn. I think we also kind of lump the sterilization of insects in that kind of category. And then biocontrol is often finding that organism that is predatory, usually from the country of origin where a lot of these pests have come from, and reintroducing them into our habitat and hoping that they'll knock their numbers down. But typically what ends up happening is you end up having to take like a multi-pronged approach. So in the end, we're going to cover this idea of integrated pest management, that it may be that you end up having to use two of these treatments, or one of them is very effective for the adult stage of the pest, one is very effective for the larval stage of the pest. So you kind of need to work from both directions there to attack and reduce that. And then finally, we'll give some examples of case studies, and we'll talk about resource concentration, which is very much this idea that anytime you have a habitat that is one giant monoculture, that's very risky, right? Pests could move into that area, and if it's amenable to them, if it's good for them, they'll just wipe it out. So think about crops. Most of our crops are sort of in that monoculture format. So you may need to give up some of your prime, crop and add in some new ones. So you lose, you reduce the risk of all of that. Do you guys know, is there a way, you probably fight this too? I normally have two screens, so I can shove this panel out of the way. Can I get rid of this so you don't see my Are you seeing my Zoom panel?
I don't think we see your Zoom panel.
Okay,
Yeah, I don't see it.
just
if
me.
You press,
Yeah,
if
I'm
you press
sorry.
like the little like minus button, it'll like hide the thumbnail thing
Oh, I don't even
on the
see
top.
minus button. I don't even have it open that big. All right, I'll just scoot it
I
around.
wouldn't worry about it. I can totally see everything on the slide.
Okay, thank you. I'll just be
Yeah.
moving it about the the screen while I'm talking to you guys. All right, so we mentioned that populations have values, right? So here's some examples of ones that are obviously there's a value, right? Rice is one of our major crops. Fishing, as we talked about, is, you know, a huge economy in certain areas, and, you know, timber harvest as well, all of our paper products, fuel, so on and so forth. So all of these are, you know, scenarios where we can envision that these populations have value. And so we need to, you know, sustain those. You know, we're going to harvest, we need to do it sustainably. We have to be able to balance, you know, what we want to take right now, knowing that we need to make money on it, but we also want to balance it with knowing that we need to be able to do this, you know, 40 years from now. So we can't take too much. It's very much this kind of evaluation that we have to do each time we make a harvest. So, you know, renewable resources, I know you guys have heard of them. These are the ones that are, you know, harvested very sustainably. They can be replenished at the same time scale that you harvest them. So for example, bamboo, it grows really, really fast. So, you know, bamboo flooring is kind of all the rage. It's just, you know, very much are selected, takes no time to grow, can be harvested, and then we'll be back in a, you know, a year or two. And that's a very, you know, renewable kind of resource. Whereas if you went and harvested one of the giant sequoias or even a northern white cedar, it's going to take a long time for them to be able to grow back. So, you know, most resources tend to be, you know, sort of a mix. But the finite resources are the ones that take so long that it really doesn't make much sense for us to be intense with our harvesting practices. It just takes too long for them to regenerate. So things, you know, it may not be the crop that we want to be working with. So here's the rationale. If we want to have sustainable harvest, and you, again, you might have heard of this term, but maximum sustainable yield. It goes back to our logistic growth equation, how populations grow N over time. So you guys, you know, remember this is the Ali effect down here in the bottom, that at, you know, as we look along the blue line, anytime we look at the slope of that, we're talking about the growth rate. So when you reach carrying capacity, you've got that flat line of no slope, you know, no growth, because you've maxed out your resources. And so the idea is harvest your populations at the level of N where they can bounce back, where your growth rate is at a maximum. So you'd want to harvest when your populations are at about half of what their estimated carrying capacity would be. And that way, whatever is remaining is going to have this really fast growth rate and should be able to recover the population. So the next slide should give you an example. As I mentioned, bamboo, a lot of return on your investment, takes about 3 to 5 years. So you can keep harvesting every 3 to 5 years. Christmas tree farms, right? Fraser fir, balsam fir trees, right? 7 to 10 years. You can plant them, you know, and it takes 7 to 10 years to get to the height most people want, and then you can harvest them. But when you think about something like a K-selected mahogany tree or the Brazil nut tree that we talked about, it can take a really long time for that population to recover if you were to harvest it. So again, that would be one that we wouldn't be going back to time and time again to harvest. So I wanted to put this flow chart up here. And it talks about, you know, the ecosystem services, pretty much lays them all out. The structure of our ecosystem, you know, who are our community members? What are the abiotic factors and conditions that we've got? Whatever those ecosystems are, they're going to provide some sort of a function. And oftentimes we end up with goods and services. And so we value them. There's use values and there's non-use values. And the use values, the consumptive ones are ones that we've covered. The non-consumptive ones are ones that, like recreation and things like that, but we're going to get to that in a sec. So non-use values, you're not using this ecosystem. It's just there and you appreciate it for what it is, right? It's sort of that kind of existential philosophy that Aldo Leopold and maybe Henry David Thoreau, possess. We abuse the land because we see it as a commodity. When we see the land as a community in which we belong, right, we're interacting with it, we're part of it, is when we begin to love and respect it. So there's that sort of a value of an ecosystem, just for being what it is. As I mentioned, right, even pest species have a value. So now we move on to the consumptive values of population. So the consumptive values are all the things that we've talked about before, the crops, the timber, the fish, the water, things that we would consume and would need to be renewed. The direct non-consumptive use, these are ones that you have definitely experienced, especially, as environmental science and bio majors. You guys take hikes, you guys go out in boats, some of you may bird. I know a lot of you look at trees these days. And so, this is direct, you're interacting with the environment, but you're not consuming. Although those that are doing plant presses, you might be consuming a little bit as you collect your samples, but you're experiencing it directly, but you are not consuming. So there's a value to that population that way. And then indirectly, these are the ones that we really get back to when we think about our ecosystem services, as I mentioned, pollution control, a lot of plants remove pollutants, a lot of bacteria remove pollutants, carbon storage. So our forests really important, right? Sequestering carbon, flood prevention. I mentioned the mangroves and certainly barrier islands, and, just the ecosystem engineers that we have, like the beaver in our communities. Oops. And so how do we get people to value these ecosystems? How do we do that? And oftentimes you got to put a price tag on it. And, this willingness to pay, how much are you willing to pay, as I give this example, to live in the city, so to live in, New York City, but to have a view of Central Park, right? Those that live around the edge here, their property tax values are going to be higher. So they're paying more for that ecosystem service, that beauty, right? The next example is with someplace in Albany. So, another city. How do we value ecosystem services? So, many of you who might live in that area or pass through that area might be aware that they burn this pine habitat. It's like a pine scrub habitat, similar to our Altona flat rock, where we have jack pine and pitch pine, except the bedrock there is a lot of sand. The soil is sandy, whereas ours is rocky. They've done surveys of the community. This is an area, if anybody lives in this area or near Wilton, it's an area really like tons of ticks, kind of like Hudson Valley type levels. And as a result, there's a high rate of Lyme disease. So they did polls of community members and said, hey, how much would you be willing to pay? Would you pay a little more in taxes if that would fund rotational burning of the scrub habitat that abuts your property, right? And so in doing so, and they did studies, it reduces the amount of ticks because there's less understory. And it creates less shrubs, more herbaceous, kind of grassy habitat for lupin to regenerate, which is the primary host plant for this endangered Carner blue butterfly. And people were for it, right? If you can reduce my risk of disease, heck yeah, burn the habitat. Let's help out those endangered species, right? So, this is how we can put some value on these ecosystem services. Another one is this idea of, if we didn't have that wetland, how much would it cost to make something that would do exactly the same thing, that would provide some sort of this, ecosystem service. So if, you removed a wetland and filled it to build a Walmart, which I believe they might have done in our area, a lot of the fill from that that build is excuse me, is in Chip Cummings Field, actually. But they have to do something to offset that. So they either have to build wetlands elsewhere, or if it was something like, we need to deal with the wastewater, because the wetlands act similar to wastewater treatment plants. How much does it cost to build a wastewater treatment plant and that can remove that same amount of nitrogen from the system? So you kind of have to, again, weigh that. So how do we manage these populations, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, anytime a population gets out of control and begins to interfere with our activities, they're known as a pest, some sort of a nuisance. And they are often, as I mentioned, those invasive species that don't have any top predator that can control them. Things to note, I have little stars here, right? 2 control measures for these pest populations that are sort of out of control: thin them, right? Reduce their abundance, or repel them. So if you guys go out and you put insect repellent on, that would be another way, or bug zapper type things. So you can reduce their the abundance of the pest, and that's often done with like aerial spraying and fumigation, things like that. Or you could repel them to just keep them away from you. They're still there. They're just going to, be avoiding you because you have something toxic on. Now, there's a cost to all of this, right? Again, you have to weigh cost to benefit. So these are the things you have to consider before you go ahead and attack the pest, right? How much damage do they do? So if we were thinking about like a insect that came in and decimated the cornfields, is the value of the corn, is it going to offset the loss, right? So is it going to offset the cost of dealing with the pest? Maybe the chemical you use, if that's the way you decide to go, costs more than the corn would itself. So again, what's the cost of the control measures? Are we going to gain anything from that crop? And then what would happen to the rest of the community? So will that be targeting just your pest, or will it affect others that are in the community? Like, for example, the lampricide. I believe we talked about lampricide in one of our earlier lectures. Very effective in knocking back lamprey, which helped the trout, right? Lamprey, end up like parasitizing the side of a fish. You dump this chemical into the water, it does a really good job in knocking back the lamprey. It photodegrades in a few days. You're not supposed to fish or swim during that period of time. And again, it was very effective. But there's a downside to using that lampricide, and that's that it was impacting a lot of the mud puppies. That those aquatic salamanders that have those external gills. They call it the axolotl. You've seen, I think, some images of them. They're really cute. I think neoteny is the term when they retain some of those juvenile features. But a lot of them were showing up as being kind of bycatch in a sense of using this lampricide. So in terms of these nuisances, pigweed in the cotton field, the zebra mussels that are clogging up a lot of the outtake pipes in wastewater treatment plants, the cane toads that are all over the place eating, local animals, and the kudzu, that's the plant that's kind of gone nuts all over that house over there. So in the southeast, that's a huge one. They have, like we mentioned in an earlier lecture, they have the ability to take on rhizobia with the nitrogen fixing root nodules, so they can explode in number even in habitat that's not so good. Other examples, hemlock woolly adelgid, you guys know that's on the move. It's pretty much taken out most of the major stands of hemlock in Pennsylvania, which stinks because hemlock is like the state tree of Pennsylvania. Deer also, New York, Pennsylvania, at that line, they're at really high densities, devastating the understory. In fact, we were on a walk yesterday with the dog, and the arborvitaes, I think you guys have seen, they're like the northern white cedar, but they're the domesticated version that you can plant as kind of like a pseudo fence in your yard. Mom and dad might have them planted, but anyways, they're totally like shaved right at the level of the height of a neck of a deer. So again, these animals, maybe they're prized, when their numbers are low. You kind of occasionally see them in your yard. I used to appreciate seeing the deer in the yard until I started noticing that they were eating all of my perennial plants. And that hadn't happened for a while. So I get a sense that, we are at a high density of deer and they're becoming a nuisance. So these are our major ways to address these populations that are out of control. As I mentioned, natural control. There's probably a predator or a parasite out there, maybe even a competitor that can keep them in check or reduce their success. We could use chemicals, so chemical control or pesticide suppression, herbicides, fungicides, molluscicides. That's what you'd use on zebra mussels. Cultural control, again, the rotation, crop rotation, mowing at certain times of year, burning your crops, leaving stuff behind when you harvest rather than clearing it all. All of those are ways that you can kind of manipulate the land to reduce, the microhabitat needs and conditions for the pest that's coming in. Biocontrol, we talked about being an organism coming in, often predatory, sometimes a fungus, that will, attack the targeted pest, and hopefully only that targeted pest. So they're going to have, good search image and be synchronous with their host that they're trying to go after, and not be able to explode in number themselves, because they're coming from that same place that's foreign typically, and they won't have anybody who can knock their numbers down if they get out of control. Then finally, genetic control, again, insertion of some gene, oftentimes bacterial genes are used to kind of shuttle these important genes in there, and often the genes are useful in like digesting the digestive tract of one of the pest insects. So there's some sort of a chemical or some sort of a mechanism that results in it sort of eating away at, imagine like a caterpillar's stomach lining. Also sterilization and mating disruption, all that stuff is, good ways that we can address these pests. So with the chemical, we'll start with the chemical because the natural is kind of understood. We could use pesticides, and we certainly do use a lot of pesticides. I think you saw in the last lecture that we continue to use more over time to gain, our crop yields. The same is true with fertilizer. And what we've learned is that it can reside long periods of time in the soil, and it also can leach long-term into the groundwater, which can be problematic. A lot of concerns about cancer in areas where there's a lot of agriculture, in addition to higher rates of cancer among, large farm, crop hands and so on, the people that work there. So they've started researching, alternative pest control. They found that some extracts of certain plants seem to have a natural propensity to knock back some of those pests. So I remember when I first moved into the house that I'm in now, we live in the woods, and so there's bugs all over the place. I've like become friendly with the ladybugs. I'm not a big fan of the stink bugs that kind of slowly creep towards you. But I certainly don't like the paper wasps. And I know that in the beginning, we kind of kept up with the pest control because, the kids were young and everything. So I had asked them, because we have a puppy. I was wondering if what they were spraying was going to be harmful to the kids and the pets. And that's when they told me that they were using this chrysanthemum oil. And it seemed to be an effective way to knock back some of them. So even though we still use this, we're still, it's not 100% effective, right? We're still losing a lot of crops. And part of the reason is this, they're really just short-term solutions. And as I mentioned, they can get into the soil and they can stick there for a long period of time. They also can affect non-target organisms, so that can be a problem. And if you continually use this over and over again, some of the crops can actually have some kind of a resistance to them. So notice the secondary pest resurgence visual down below. This is the number of plant hoppers over days. If you did nothing, the natural ebb and flow of the population and over time, sort of like natural population regulation, keeps them at a moderate level. But if you spray with an insecticide, or pesticide, you'll notice there may be a period of time where the growth of them slows, but then they ramp up again. So then you have to spray again, and then they ramp up again. And part of that is because you've knocked back all the other non-target organisms that are predators, right? There could be like ladybugs that will eat the pest as well, and you've killed all the ladybugs. So you'll notice that it kind of has this exponential trajectory, even though you're using these pesticides. But then at a certain time, their numbers decline, right? That's what happens with self-regulation, right? When they get to their carrying capacity, they're sort of, in a sense, self-regulating themselves. But it's sometimes better to do nothing at all and let the natural system knock it back. So chemical wise, I know that you guys are familiar with DDT, Rachel Carson's classic book. It was used to kind of quench the issue we had with Dutch elm disease, right? Dutch elm disease wiped out all of our these were the large trees, like large, even bigger, some of them, than the white pines that you saw out in Ruger Woods. But it changed the forest. The fact that Dutch elm disease came in, it changed what our forests and what our streets looked like, because a lot of them were street trees. But it also had, long-term persistence in the soil. And so all the soil invertebrates, including, the earthworms, were retaining them, right? We talked about bioaccumulation in the organism over the course of their lifetime. Then we talked about biomagnification, right? As it moves up the food chain. So, again, Rachel Carson was noticing that, birds aren't singing. And a lot of that was worked back, lots of research, observations all over the place, and you're finding that this bioaccumulation into the fat tissues was causing long-term issues. In lots of cases, there was just limited reproduction among these birds. The effect of the pesticide was resulting in thinner eggshells, which affects gas exchange, and so there was, again, less hatching and increased mortality. Now, the good news is, there was a huge movement after Silent Spring, a movement to reduce the amount and dependency on these chemicals that we were using. And so you can see this graph here, the number of occupied nests. These are osprey over time. It was a fairly rapid positive trajectory that we took once DDT was banned. And so raptors like the osprey and the peregrine falcon, we have, both of them around here. It was fairly quick that reproduction really kicked it up a notch once that was banned. But I do want you to see that over time, you still, like low numbers of peregrine falcon in Hawk Mountain, which is in Pennsylvania. We used to take field trips there. That's related to the chemicals, right? And then you have a period of, growth. And for a lot of raptors, and I was trying to Google to figure it out this morning, a lot of raptors have had this decline, like not in the 90s and the 2000s. There was this period of kind of stable, no growth, right, during this period of time. One of the articles that I found suggested that that's a period of time when West Nile virus was pretty high and impacting these animals. So I can believe that might be one of the contributors to that, but it seems like it's on the rise. I didn't find in the time I had, I didn't find a longer term. This is 2005 it ends, but certainly we are well past then. Another group of pesticides that we need to kind of really be thinking about and the use and the overuse are those neonicotinoids, right? And so honeybees and this, colony collapse disorder, trying to figure out what was causing this. You know, a lot of people are sort of attributing it to a lot of these chemicals, and maybe even, you know, the fact that we have BT corn and the pollen is somehow impacting these pollinators. And so here's sort of a diagram of what these common pesticides, they're really used all the time. They're kind of getting really controversial because more and more studies are pointing to them having a contribution to this collapse of you know, pollinating bees. They work by binding to, you know, these are neonicotinoids, right? So they're binding to that nicotinic receptor that is basically, you know, allowing for acetylcholine to help in triggering and firing in the nervous system. So over time, these bees just kind of go all out of whack, you know, in their nervous system, and it stresses them out to the point where they end up dead. And again, this is kind of used worldwide, globally, nationally, and there's a huge concern for the use of those particular neonicotinoids in dealing with pests. So biocontrol, we can move on to biocontrol. This is where we would go over to the country of origin where a lot of these invaders have come from and find a predator. One example here is with our hemlock woolly adelgid. We don't have any. I know we saw some hemlock when we were out at Ruger, but thankfully, knock on wood, we don't have any woolly adelgid up where we are. There are parts of Vermont who have actually noted the presence of it. So this is the fuzz that you see on the outside of the adelgid, the tiny little insect, who's piercing the petiole of a lot of these needles. So they're sucking out the sugars, and then they brown. The hemlock will brown. So you can see the little insect here, and over time we see all this defoliation, which is crazy because hemlock is, you know, a co-dominant climax type species. So things that you need to do with biocontrol, you've got to find your predator and hopefully find him as a specialist. You've got to come back and do lab work because you can't just, you know, willy-nilly release these organisms, because who knows, you could have a trophic cascade. And then you want to monitor long term, and you probably want to do releases. If you have positive lab results, you want to do releases kind of in an area that you know you could contain it if something were to occur. So here's some horror stories with biocontrol, and some have some positive endings. So a lot of times people you know, bring things over to other countries because they're pretty. And that was the case of this prickly pear cactus. So these look like, you know, beaver tail, and they have, you know, beautiful flowers and fruit that's delicious. But they were brought over as an ornamental, and they just took off in that kind of habitat. Nothing wanted to eat them. They overtook people's lawns. They overtook cropland. And part of why they're really good is they are like a cactus, right? So they are photosynthetic, perfect for living in Australia. Every part of them photosynthesizes. They're okay when drought happens. They're okay when herbivores are around. And part of the reason why it exploded is that a lot of the land, I mean, not so much the ones that were in their you know, community, but a lot of the land where the crops were, they were not really lucrative areas. They were sort of like, you know, places where incidental crops would grow and not necessarily what, you know, what thrived in Australia. So the cost to treat these cacti ended up being more than what they were willing to pay. So over time, you know, they had to figure out what this, you know, what seemed to work and where, you know, it came from, where the, you know, origin of this particular cactus, you know, was. They ended up finding a North Argentinian moth. So they went over and they found and harvested, you know, like a lot of these caterpillars, and they brought the caterpillars in. They were a good choice, right? They have high reproduction. The adults don't live very long, so they're not going to get out of control. And the larvae are the ones that are going to feed on the pads of the cactus without any problem and leave these gaping holes. So a fungus could actually get in and do the rest of the work. So sort of like beach bark disease, how there was kind of an insect and then there was a fungus. So it was pretty effective. They introduced it first in 1914 with limited success, and they did it again in 1925 in a few different locations, and they really knocked back the population, got it under control. Every once in a while you see it resurges, but then these moths kind of put it back in check, and the moths have never gotten out of control. It's been a very effective tool. Another really effective one is salvinia. Salvinia is a floating fern. You guys remember when we talked about lambda, that kind of intrinsic rate of growth, where we mentioned it usually happens in non-overlapping generations like salmon, but I also mentioned the term salvinia. So this is the plant where, like a new one will bud off while these older ones down the end will drop off. So this is a native South American plant. You can see that it gets like zebra mussels. It just like overtakes an entire water body. You can't get boats through there. You can't fish. Nothing really, locally wants to eat it because of the chemicals. It's got a really high growth rate, and they're clonal. So it took them a while to figure it out because they couldn't determine where it came from. Once they figured out where it came from, they were able to find something that would eat it. And so they found this weevil, which is like a little beetle with a long nose. What they found is that they had to do kind of that two-pronged approach that we discussed, right? The larvae, if you introduce the larvae, so kind of the juvenile stage, they're going to eat the roots and the rhizomes, so the underwater parts of this plant. They will nip those, but the adults will go after the buds and some of the sort of floating part above the water. So if you can introduce both kind of phases, you can knock this back pretty quickly. And so the next slide is pretty knock your socks off, right? This didn't take very long. So biocontrol of salvinia, this was in 1982. This is the same scene. This was October of 1982. This is the same scene in September of 1983. And there's the little weevil. Pretty darn effective. So what are some of the traits that are useful in a biocontrol agent? Remember, these are going to be the predatory organisms or a parasite or a fungus typically. So here are the top kind of 8 organisms that are usually brought over to take care of an invader or an organism that is a pest, which can often be coming in from another country, right? So they're host specific. They're going to target that pest organism or that weed, right? They're going to be synchronous. Their life cycle will be synchronous with the pest. So the cane toad, I think we talked about the cane toad, but the cane toad was brought in to Australia to eat that cane grub, right? This little insect that was eating the sugar cane, which was a major crop. But the cane toad stays on the ground because they're huge, right? And they don't climb. And the cane grub was high up on the sugar cane. So they were spatially separated. In addition, they were like temporally separated. One was active at night, one was active during the day, and they never came in contact with one another. So it was really a failed attempt. So they've got to be synchronous with the pest. They have to be active at the same time the pest is around. They also should have a really high rate of increase. So usually are selected organisms so that they could ramp up their reproduction and attack the pest. But at the same time, if they were really effective at eating the pest, they could kind of chill in low numbers and be ready for when another outbreak kind of happened. So they wouldn't necessarily explode. They could be fine with this low abundance. The other thing, and it's an important thing, is that they should have a high searching ability, that they should be able to find their targeted host. Genetic control, another means. We've got, two major ways. One's genetic manipulation. So add and insert some kind of a gene that's going to cause cause something that will negatively impact the pest. And result in you not having to spray your crops with chemicals. If the herbivore can munch on your plant and immediately kind of croak, then that's better than having to spray the entire crop field with a certain chemical. And then altering pest fecundity. So we mentioned sterilization, right? Taking the males, zapping them with UV so that they become sterilized, and then releasing these sterile males. That might be a way, the females won't know, perhaps, and that would reduce the populations. In fact, my sister-in-law is in Key West right now, and they are releasing these sterile males to the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the one that was associated with Zika virus. They're releasing them in a bunch of different locations to do just this, to hopefully trick the females into mating and reducing numbers. So what are some of the negatives associated with the genetic control? Is perhaps resistance. You can insert a gene, right? But over time, the fungus that the gene was inserted to control becomes resistant, and so this is the potato, remember the Irish potato famine. Over time, they've sort of genetically manipulated potatoes so that they no longer are impacted by this fungal blight, and they've had to over time continue to tweak that gene so that the fungus is still going to be impacted by it. And even in our area, I remember when I first moved here, they had talked about not planting certain plants that you bought at like Lowe's, these big box stores, because this particular fungus was back in town. All right, I'm going to stop there. I think we'll pick up. We don't have that many slides left of this lesson. I'll pick up there on Monday, and then we'll move forward with our last lecture on conservation. Hopefully, leave with some positivity, rather than all these pests and how we should control them without harming ourselves. Anyways, you guys have a great weekend. If you have time, feel free to work on that disease homework. Many of you did the nutrient cycling homework. Great job on that. If you haven't, make sure you guys do. Next week in lab, we have worming, right? So everybody make sure you are ready to go and meet us out at Ruger Woods on your designated lab day. But again, have a great weekend, you guys.
Thank you.
All right, bye.